Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku's reality was just a simulation. Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The world was a symphony of controlled chaos, and Izuku Midoriya was its conductor. The air in training ground Gamma tasted of pulverized concrete and ozone. It was a familiar flavor, the after-dinner mint of a hard day's work for Class 1A. All around him, the skeletal remains of high-rise buildings clawed at a sky painted the artificial blue of a perfect afternoon. Twisted rebar snaked from shattered pillars like metallic entrails, and the streets were a treacherous mosaic of asphalt, glass, and debris. Their opponent was the centerpiece of this destructive orchestra, the Colossus, a custom-built monstrosity from the UAE development studio. It stood a good 50 meters tall, a titan of chrome and carbon fiber with 4 hydraulic arms, each capable of ending in a different configuration. A wrecking ball, a pincer claw, a multi-barrel laser cannon. Its head was a single, baleful crimson optic that swept across the cityscape, tracking targets with unnerving precision. DKU. Status report, you nerd! Bakugo's voice crackled through his earpiece, a sound like gravel in a blender. He was a flickering star of orange light 3 blocks to the east, his explosions punctuating the robot's lumbering advance. Its armor plating is too thick for frontal assaults, Kakin! Izuku yelled back, ducking behind a slab of fallen wall as a volley of lasers stitched a glowing seam across its surface. Green lightning, the telltale sign of one for all, danced across his limbs. The joints are reinforced. Todoroki, can you impede its movement? On it came the cool, level reply. From a rooftop to the west, a glacier erupted. A massive wave of ice, glittering and immense, surged down the side of a skyscraper and flooded the street. It crashed against the Colossus's legs, encasing them in a thick prison of frost. The giant robot strained, its joints groaning in protest, its momentum finally halted. This was their rhythm. This was the growth that had been forged in the crucible of countless battles, from the USJ to the Paranormal Liberation War. Izuku was no longer just the wielder of a devastating power. He was the tactical nexus. Bakugo wasn't just raw aggression, he was a surgical shock trooper. Todoroki was no longer a man divided. He was the ultimate environmental controller. They moved as a single, devastating unit. It's working! Izuku muttered, his mind racing, cataloging every detail. He watched the Colossus struggle against the ice. Its core temperature is rising as it fights the ice. The emergency vents on its back will have to open. That's our primary target. Finally! Just tell me what to blow up. Bakugo roared, a grin undoubtedly stretching across his face. Not yet! We need a clear shot, and it's protecting its back. We need to expose the front torso. The central power core is right behind the chest plate. It's a secondary weakness, but if we can crack it, we can trigger a system-wide failure. Izuku's eyes darted across the battlefield, his brain a supercomputer processing angles, velocities, and probabilities. Todoroki, I need a ramp. Aim for the building 200 meters in front of it. Kakin, you're the battering ram. Hit the chest plate with a full-power howitzer impact. The goal isn't to destroy it, just to crack the casing and draw its fire. I'll follow right behind you and finish it. You better not miss, damn Deku, Bakugo shot back, but there was no real heat in it. It was the sound of trust, filtered through a lifetime of rivalry. I won't. A new river of ice, this one smooth and angled, shot from Todoroki's position, forming a perfect, glistening ramp that led directly towards the Colossus's chest. Without a moment's hesitation, Bakugo was airborne, his explosions propelling him up the ramp like a human cannonball. Die! He screamed, his voice a primal roar of joyous battle. He spun in the air, gathering kinetic energy and explosive power into a single, blinding point of light. The resulting boom was deafening. The howitzer impact struck the robot's chest dead center. It wasn't enough to pierce it, but a web of hairline fractures spread from the point of impact, and more importantly, the robot's single red eye swiveled to focus entirely on the airborne threat of Bakugo. Now! Izuku screamed to himself. He crouched, pouring every ounce of his being into the power thrumming beneath his skin. One for all wasn't just a part of him anymore. It felt like his very soul, a galaxy of stars and whispers contained within his blood. He could feel the phantom presences of the vestiges, a silent, encouraging chorus in the back of his mind. Focus 9th. The green lightning intensified, arcing from his body and scorching the ground around his feet. The wind whipped around him, a vortex of his own making. He bent his knees, the muscles in his legs coiling like industrial springs. One for all. 100%. He launched himself forward. The world became a blur of gray and blue. He was a green comet, a bolt of pure purpose. The distance to the Colossus vanished in a fraction of a second. Bakugo was already using smaller explosions to maneuver away, his part of the plan complete. The robot's fractured chest plate loomed before him, the sole focus of his universe. He drew back his arm, channeling the storm of power into his fist. He could feel the familiar, agonizing strain on his bones and ligaments, a screaming protest that he had long since learned to ignore. This was it. The final blow. The perfect culmination of their teamwork. Delaware. Smash! Time seemed to swell, to thicken like honey. He was in that perfect, crystalline moment of execution, the space between intent and impact. His fist was a hair's breadth from the fractured metal, and then the world broke. It wasn't a slow tear or a gentle fracture. It was a violent, instantaneous negation. For a single, impossible frame of existence, the sky vanished. The perfect artificial blue was replaced by a cascading grid of emerald green code, letters and numbers in a language he'd never seen but somehow understood as data. The crumbling, hyperrealistic buildings around him lost all their texture and depth, flattening into smooth, unrendered gray polygons, like a half-finished blueprint of a city. The Colossus itself, the chrome and carbon fiber titan, became a dull, matte gray model, its crimson eye an unlit circle. The most jarring part was the sound. The roaring wind, the distant crackle of Bakugo's explosions, the groan of the robot's straining joints, it all vanished. In its place, for that same infinitesimal sliver of time, was a single, piercing sound that felt like it was inside his skull and in the air all at once. SKZZT. It was the sound of a needle being ripped from a record, the shriek of a corrupted file, the electric death of a failing circuit board. And then, just as quickly it was gone. The world snapped back into place. The sky was blue. The robot was chrome. The wind roared in his ears, but the moment was lost. His mind, reeling from a sensory input it couldn't possibly process, had caused his body to falter. A microscopic hesitation, a tremor of doubt that traveled from his brain down his spine and into his fist. His aim was off by a scant few inches. His knuckles, wrapped in a hurricane of green energy, struck the robot's chest. The impact was cataclysmic. A shockwave erupted outwards, shattering windows for blocks. The metal of the Colossus's chest plate buckled and tore like wet paper. But he hadn't hit the spiderweb of cracks Bakugo had created. He'd hit a solid section 2 feet to the left. He had missed the secondary weakness. The robot shuddered violently, stumbling back, its torso grievously wounded but not critically. The crimson eye, flickering with error signals, swiveled from Bakugo's retreating form and locked onto him. What the hell was that, DKU? Bakugo's voice ripped through his earpiece, seething with genuine confusion and anger. You were right there. You hesitated. I don't. Izuku stammered, his body still airborne, his mind still trying to reconcile the image of a world made of code with the solid, painful reality of his aching fist. He had no answer. What could he say? The world flickered? He didn't have time to think. One of the Colossus's arms, reconfigured into a massive pincer, swung at him with lethal speed. Instinct took over where conscious thought had failed. He fired a black whip tendril from his free hand, the dark energy grappling onto a nearby building. He pulled, swinging his body out of the pincer's path with inches to spare. The claw snapped shut on empty air with a sound like a guillotine. Midoriya, fall back. It's still operational. Todoroki's voice was a welcome anchor in his sea of confusion. Izuku landed hard on a rooftop, skidding to a halt. He looked at his hands, then back at the battlefield. Everything looked normal. Stubbornly, terrifyingly normal. There was no green grid in the sky. The robot was dented and smoking, but it was solid metal. It was nothing, a part of his brain screamed. Asterisk exhaustion. the light from your own quirk reflecting in your eyes. A micro-sleep. It was nothing, but the static buzz, he could still feel the ghost of that sound vibrating behind his eyes. I'm okay, he yelled, forcing his body back into motion. Its central processor is rebooting from the damage. It's open. He had to end this. He had to get back to solid ground, back to a world that made sense. He fired 2 more black whip tendrils, latching onto the robot's damaged chest. He wasn't strong enough for another 100% smash, not without turning his arm to pulp. But he was smart. He pulled, using the tendrils to rip open the gash he'd already made. Metal shrieked as he tore the chest plate open like a tin can, exposing the glowing, pulsating power core within. Kaken, now! Another explosion, smaller but laser-focused, shot past him. Bakugo's AP shot pierced the air and slammed directly into the exposed core. There was a high-pitched whine, and then the Colossus's crimson eye dimmed. Its massive limbs went limp, and with a final, shuddering groan, the 50-meter Titan crashed to the ground, defeated. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the panting of the 3 boys in their earpieces. The exam was over. They had won. But as Izuku Midoriya stood on that rooftop, staring at the Feld machine, a cold, quiet dread began to seep into his bones. He hadn't just seen a trick of the light. He knew it. And he knew, with a certainty that terrified him, that no one else had seen a thing. A moment's hesitation at a critical juncture can mean the difference between victory and defeat. Worse, it can mean the difference between life and death. Aizawa-sensei's voice was as dry and unforgiving as ever. They were in the observation room now, a dimly lit chamber dominated by a panoramic screen that currently showed a replay of Izuku's flawed attack in slow motion. The other members of Class 1A were there, their initial whoops of victory having been silenced by Aizawa's critique. You were lucky this was a machine, Midoriya, Aizawa continued, his eyes, dark and tired, boring into him. A sentient villain would have capitalized on that opening. You would be a smear on the pavement. What happened? Izuku's throat was dry. He could feel everyone's eyes on him. He couldn't tell them the truth. They'd think he was insane, or making excuses. He glanced at All Might, who stood nearby in his skeletal form. The former number 1 hero looked concerned, his deep-set eyes filled with a worried curiosity. I'm not sure, sir, Izuku mumbled, bowing his head. It was the only answer he could give. I think for a second, the pressure just got to me. My focus slipped. It won't happen again. It felt like a lie made of ash in his mouth. Aizawa stared at him for a long, uncomfortable moment before sighing, a sound of profound weariness. See that it doesn't. Your teamwork was exemplary up to that point. Your strategy was sound, but a plan is only as strong as its execution. Dismissed. As the class began to file out, buzzing with chatter about the exam, All Might placed a thin, bony hand on Izuku's shoulder. Young Midoriya, he said, his voice a low rumble. Are you all right? That wasn't like you. Izuku looked up into his mentor's face, the face of the man who had given him everything. For a desperate second, he wanted to pour it all out, the grid in the sky, the gray robot, the static buzz. But how could he? How could he explain the impossible to the very symbol of what was real and true? I'm just tired, All Might, he said, forcing a smile that felt brittle. It was a tough exam. I just need some rest. All Might's brow furrowed, but he nodded slowly. Of course. You've all been pushing yourselves. Just be mindful of your limits. Even the strongest heroes have them. As Izuku walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that All Might's words of comfort, usually a balm to his soul, felt hollow. Pre-rehearsed. Like a perfectly logical explanation designed to soothe an illogical fear. He shook his head, angry at himself. How could he even think that about All Might? He was just tired. He had to be. Back at the Heights Alliance dorms, the atmosphere was thick with celebratory energy. Sato was in the kitchen, stress-baking a victory cake that was filling the common room with the scent of chocolate and vanilla. Kaminari and Siro were dramatically reenacting Bakugo's howitzer impact on the sofa, with Kirishima providing sound effects. It was so manly how you just flew right at it. Kirishima exclaimed, his voice full of admiration. Shut up, weird hair. I was just doing what the nerd said. Bakugo barked, though he didn't move to stop their antics. He was slouched in an armchair, feigning disinterest, but a sliver of pride was visible in his posture. Izuku sat at a table, a glass of water untouched in front of him. He watched his friends, his family. He saw Uraraka laughing, her cheeks rosy. He saw Ida chopping the air with his hands, lecturing Kaminari on sofa safety. He saw Tsuyu watching the scene with a small, quiet smile. It all looked so real. So perfectly, wonderfully real. So why did he feel like he was watching a movie? A cold dread coiled in his stomach. The memory of the glitch, the SKZZZT, played on a loop in his mind. He kept replaying it, dissecting it, trying to find a rational explanation. A reflection. A neurological misfire from using one for all. A new, weird side effect of having multiple quirks. He clung to these possibilities like a drowning man to a piece of driftwood. Deku? Are you okay? You've been staring at your water for 5 minutes. Uraraka's voice pulled him from his trance. She was standing beside him, her head tilted with genuine concern. You were amazing out there today, but you seem really out of it. Oh. Uraraka! He jumped slightly. Sorry. Yeah, I'm fine. Just processing. Aizawa-sensei was right. I messed up the final hit. No way, she said, her expression fierce. You won. Your plan was perfect. Everyone makes mistakes. Don't be so hard on yourself. Her support was so pure, so unwavering. It should have made him feel better. Instead, a strange, new thought slithered into his mind, ugly and unwelcome. Her response is exactly what you'd expect. It's the perfect, encouraging thing to say, He recoiled from his own thought, horrified. What was wrong with him? Thanks, Uraraka, he said, forcing another smile. I appreciate it. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't sit in this room filled with warmth and friendship, while this cold, alien thing was nesting in his brain. He excused himself, claiming he needed a shower, and retreated to the solitude of his room. His All Might-themed room, usually a sanctuary of inspiration, felt claustrophobic. The smiling posters seemed to watch him, their grins too wide, too perfect. He bypassed his desk, with its meticulously organized hero analysis journals, and went to his closet. He rummaged in the back, behind a stack of old textbooks, and pulled out a plain, black, spiral-bound notebook he'd bought for a class he'd dropped. It was empty. Unspoiled. He sat on his bed, the notebook open on his lap. He uncapped a pen, the click sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet room. For a long time, he just stared at the first blank, line page. Writing it down would make it real. It would give form to the formless horror. But keeping it in his head felt like letting a poison spread. With a trembling hand, he wrote a single word at the top of the page. Anomalies. Beneath it, he began to write, his pen scratching frantically across the paper. Date, XX/XX. Time, approximate, 14:30. Location, Training Ground Gamma. Event, Practical Exam versus Colossus Robot. Anomaly 1, Visual/auditory hallucination? He described it in painstaking detail. The flickering. The grid of green code that replaced the sky. He tried to sketch it, his drawing clumsy and inadequate. He described the robot flattening into a gray, untextured model. He wrote the word unrendered and then stared at it. Where had that word come from? It had just appeared in his head, a perfect descriptor for what he'd seen. He wrote about the sound. He tried to spell it out, SKZZZT. He underlined it 3 times. He noted that it was instantaneous, synchronized perfectly with the visual distortion. He wrote that no one else had noticed. That Bakugo had only seen his hesitation. That Aizawa and All Might had attributed it to stress. He filled 3 pages, his handwriting growing more frantic. When he was done, he read it over. It looked like the ravings of a madman. Maybe he was. A part of him, the rational, scientific part that loved to analyze quirks, desperately wanted to test the hypothesis. If it was a hallucination tied to One for All, could he replicate it? He went out onto his small balcony. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the UA campus. The air was cool and crisp. He took a deep breath and closed his eyes, concentrating. He let one for all flow through him, not at 100%, but at a controlled 8%. Green lightning crackled faintly around his body. He opened his eyes and looked at the sky, at the trees, at the distant school building. Everything was normal. The sky was a beautiful gradient of orange and purple. The trees had texture, each leaf distinct. The building was solid brick and glass. He pushed the power higher. 15%. 20%. The power hummed, a familiar thrum of energy. He felt the strain, but the world remained stubbornly, infuriatingly real. He searched for any flicker, any distortion, any hint of the green grid. There was nothing. He let the power fade, slumping against the railing in defeat. A wave of relief washed over him, so potent it made him dizzy. It had been nothing. A one-time event, a freak neurological event brought on by the immense strain of a 100% smash. He had proof. He couldn't replicate it. It wasn't real. He felt foolish, paranoid. He went back inside, took the new notebook, and shoved it under his mattress. He wouldn't look at it again. He would forget this. He would go downstairs, eat some of Sato's cake, and laugh with his friends. He would be normal again. He stripped off his uniform and took a long, hot shower, letting the water wash away the grime of the day and, he hoped, the residue of his paranoia. He put on his pajamas, the t-shirt shirt that always made him feel a little more grounded. Exhaustion finally hit him like a physical blow. The adrenaline from the fight, the mental strain of his paranoia, the failed experiment, it had all drained him. He didn't have the energy to go back downstairs. He just wanted to sleep. He crawled into bed, the sheets cool against his skin. The room was dark, the only light a pale sliver of moonlight filtering through a gap in his curtains. His muscles ached in a good, familiar way. His mind felt blessedly empty. He was finally letting go, drifting on the edge of sleep, the memory of the flicker fading into the realm of a bad dream. He was safe. He was in his room at UA. The world made sense. He was almost asleep. SKZZT. It was identical. The same sharp, static buzz. Not a hallucination. Not a memory. It was real. It was in his room. It was everywhere and nowhere. It lasted for less than a second, a blade of impossible sound slicing through the silence. And then it was gone. Izuku Midoriya's eyes snapped open. He was rigid, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He stared into the oppressive darkness of his room, his ears straining, listening for a sound that was no longer there. The silence that followed was louder than the noise had been. It wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't his quirk. It wasn't a dream. It was real. And it was happening again. He lay there for a long, long time, frozen in the dark, a single, terrifying question echoing in the silent chambers of his mind. What is happening to my world? The night had been a war fought on the battlefield of his own bedsheets. Izuku had stared into the suffocating darkness, ears straining for a repeat of the static buzz, until his exhaustion finally overpowered his terror. Sleep, when it came, was not a peaceful respite but a chaotic landscape of flickering green grids and the silent, smiling faces of his all-might posters. He woke up feeling not rested, but hunted. He forced himself through the motions of the morning. The cold splash of water on his face, the familiar scratch of his toothbrush, the slightly too tight fit of his school uniform. Each mundane act was a desperate attempt to anchor himself to a reality that felt like it was made of sand. He walked to the main building with Ida and Uraraka, their cheerful morning chatter a wall of sound he couldn't seem to penetrate. He smiled, he nodded, he offered one-word responses, but his mind was elsewhere, scanning the world for cracks. He eyed the other students passing in the halls, the way the sunlight fell across the floor, the rustling of leaves on the trees outside. Everything was stubbornly, maddeningly normal. It was a dream, he told himself, a desperate mantra. Asterisk, the static was just my ears ringing. Hypnagogic hallucination. It's a documented phenomenon, asterisk. He was trying to build a fortress of logic around himself, but he knew its walls were paper thin. The morning bell chimed, sharp and clear. Class 1A settled into their seats, the usual low hum of chatter dying down as the door slid open. Shota Aizawa shuffled in, cocooned in his yellow sleeping bag as always. He unzipped himself and stepped out, looking as though he just wrestled a bear and lost. "All right, settle down," he droned, his voice the auditory equivalent of sandpaper. "Let's not waste time." He stepped up to the podium, his tired eyes sweeping over the class. Izuku hunched over his desk, pen poised over a fresh page in his regular hero analysis notebook. Normal, he thought. This is normal. Focus on what's normal. Aizawa began his lecture. Following the incident with the Colossus drone, it's become clear that while your combat applications are improving, your understanding of post-conflict procedure is still lagging. Today, we'll be covering the legal ramifications of collateral damage during unsanctioned vigilante actions. The topic was dry, technical, and blessedly boring. It was perfect. Izuku began taking notes, his focus narrowing to the familiar cadence of his teacher's voice and the scratch of his pen on the page. He could do this. He could drown out the fear with facts and figures. The primary distinction falls under jurisdictional liability, Aizawa said, turning to write the phrase on the board. A strange echo reverberated in Izuku's mind. Not a sound, but a feeling. A phantom memory of having heard that exact phrase, in that exact tone, in this exact room. He shook his head slightly, a flicker of unease. It was just a coincidence, Aizawa continued. If a hero operating outside their registered prefecture engages a villain, any subsequent property damage is subject to review by a different set of regulations than if they were on home turf. This is to prevent. Izuku's pen froze mid-sentence. The feeling was stronger now, a rising tide of familiarity. It was like listening to a song for the first time and already knowing the next lyric. He knew what Aizawa was going to say next. He knew it with an impossible, bone-deep certainty. Heroes from chasing fame by pursuing villains into territories where they lack local knowledge, potentially increasing civilian risk, Aizawa finished. The words matched the ones in Izuku's head perfectly. A cold, electric shock jolted through him. This wasn't a coincidence. He looked down at his notes. He hadn't written anything ahead. He glanced at his classmates. Kaminari was already starting to look glassy-eyed. Jiro was doodling in her notebook. No one else seemed to notice anything strange. Aizawa turned back from the board. The key document governing this is the Hero Public Safety Commission's revised Statute 34B, which clearly states. This time, Izuku didn't just know the words. He felt them. The entire sensory experience wrapped around him like a shroud. The specific hardness of the wooden chair against his back, the faint scent of chalk dust in the air, the precise way the light from the window reflected off Aizawa's goggles. It was a perfect, crystalline replay. He found his own lips moving, silently forming the words a fraction of a second before they left Aizawa's mouth. That the financial burden of reconstruction falls to the hero's agency unless a state of emergency has been officially declared by a local authority. His blood ran cold. He slammed his mouth shut, his heart hammering against his ribs. He dropped his pen, and it clattered loudly on the desk. Several heads turned his way. "Problem, Midoriya?" Aizawa asked, his gaze sharp. "And no, sir." "Sorry," Izuku stammered, fumbling to pick up his pen. "Dropped my pen." He felt a wave of dizziness wash over him. This wasn't memory. They had never covered Statute 34B before. He would have remembered. He would have dedicated an entire section to it in his journal. This was new material. So how did he know it? He felt like a puppet, and for a terrifying moment, he had seen the strings. He knew the script. Aizawa would finish his point, Kaminari would let out a barely suppressed yawn, and Jiro, sitting behind him, would subtly jab him in the back with one of her earphone jacks. He braced himself, watching the scene play out in his mind's eye. Aizawa finished his sentence. Kaminari's jaw started to drop in the predicted yawn. And then the script tore itself apart. "Monsieur Aizawa." Aoyama's hand shot into the air, glittering with an almost celestial light. His arm was ramrod straight, his posture impeccable. The world seemed to tilt on its axis for Izuku. Aoyama wasn't supposed to do that. He wasn't in the script. Aizawa sighed, a long-suffering sound. "Yes, Aoyama? While the financial burdens are, of course, a practical concern," Aoyama said, striking a pose in his chair, "I must ask, does this statute account for the aesthetic impact of heroic battles? Can a hero be sued for being unfabulous in the execution of their duties? For leaving behind a battlefield that is not just damaged, but tragically lacking in panache? A few students snickered. Kaminari's yawn turned into a choked laugh. Jiro, instead of jabbing Kaminari, just rolled her eyes and rested her chin in her hand. The divergence was small, trivial. But for Izuku, it was a seismic event. The world he thought he had a preview of had just improvised. A wave of nausea so profound it almost made him gag rolled through him. The edges of his vision swam. The perfect, crisp memory of the future dissolved into a confusing mess. Was his déjà vu flawed? Was he just going crazy after all? Or was something else happening? Was the world correcting a mistake he wasn't supposed to see? He gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles white, trying to ground himself as Aizawa gave Aoyama a deadpan response about how fabulousness was not a legally defensible position. The world was no longer a predictable script. It was a chaotic, unpredictable thing again. And somehow, that was even more terrifying. The lunch bell was a mercy. Izuku practically fled the classroom, ignoring Uraraka's concerned call of his name. He couldn't face her. He couldn't face any of them. Their normal, easy interactions felt like an elaborate stage play, and his own stilted performance was becoming more obvious by the second. He got his lunch from Lunch Rush, a bowl of katsudon, but the smell of it, usually a source of immense comfort, just turned his stomach. He needed to be alone. He needed to observe. He found a small, isolated table in a corner of the bustling cafeteria, far from the lively hub of Class 1A. He pretended to be engrossed in a textbook, but his eyes were wide, scanning the crowd. He was a scientist in a haunted house, trying to find the ghost with methodical observation. For 20 minutes, there was nothing. Just the cacophony of hundreds of students eating and talking. The clatter of trays, the bursts of laughter, the endless chatter. It was a perfect portrait of mundane high school life. The rational part of his brain was soothed. See? You're fine. It was just a stressful morning. Then he saw him, a boy from the General Studies course, with unassuming brown hair and a standard issue uniform. Izuku didn't know his name. The boy was walking down a main thoroughfare of the cafeteria, holding a textbook and looking at his phone. As he neared a corner, a girl with a long ponytail, walking from the perpendicular direction, turned into his path. The boy, not looking up, bumped into her. He dropped his textbook. It hit the linoleum floor with a sharp thwack. My apologies, totally my fault, the boy said, his voice flat and unremarkable. He bent down, picked up his book, gave a cursory nod, and continued on his way. The girl just shrugged and kept walking. It was a completely normal, forgettable interaction. The kind of thing that happens a dozen times a day in a crowded school. Izuku would have thought nothing of it, except for the cold knot of dread that was already tightening in his gut. He kept his eyes on the boy, who walked to the end of the hall, turned around, and began walking back. He watched. He waited. His katsudon grew cold. Approximately 5 minutes later, the same boy walked down the same path, staring at the same phone. The same girl with the long ponytail approached the same corner. Izuku's breath hitched. It couldn't be. The boy bumped into her. The textbook fell, hitting the floor with the exact same thwack. My apologies, totally my fault, the boy said. Same words. Same flat, unremarkable tone. He picked up the book, nodded, and walked away. The girl shrugged and left. It wasn't similar. It was identical. The timing, the movements, the intonation. It was a perfect, flawless repetition. A loop. Izuku's heart began to race. This was different from the déjà vu. This was external. This was something he could see, something happening out there, in the world. He felt a surge of his old analytical drive, the part of him that breaks down quirks, but this time it was mixed with a potent dose of sheer terror. He had to test it. He had to be sure. His hands were trembling as he picked up his lunch tray. He stood up, his legs feeling unsteady. The loop would happen again in about 3 minutes if the pattern held. He walked over to the path the boy was taking, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He knelt down, pretending to tie his shoe, and placed his plastic tray on the floor. He didn't block the entire path, just a corner of it. The edge of the red plastic tray now intersected the exact spot where the boy's left foot would land mid-stride. He retreated to his table, his eyes glued to the tray. He felt insane. He was a hero in training, setting a trip hazard in a cafeteria to test a theory about a repeating student. The boy appeared, right on schedule. Walking, phone out, Izuku held his breath. The boy's stride was unchanged. He didn't see the tray. His left foot came down, right on course. Izuku braced himself for the clatter of the tray, for the boy to trip, for the loop to be broken. None of that happened. The boy's foot made contact with the corner of the tray, and the world stuttered. For a split second, where the black leather of the boy's shoe met the red plastic of the tray, reality failed to render. The corner of the tray didn't clatter or move. It shimmered. The solid red color dissolved into a patch of that sickening, familiar green grid. It pixelated, the sharp edges blurring into a series of tiny, distinct squares of light. Simultaneously, a tiny, localized sound hit Izuku's ears, like the pop of a single static charge. ZZT, the boy's foot passed through the corner of the tray as if it wasn't there. His shoe, for the instant it was in contact with the glitching plastic, also seemed to lose its texture, becoming a flat, unlit gray, and then his foot was past it. The tray was whole again, a solid red piece of plastic. The boy continued, unfazed, and bumped into the girl. The book dropped. My apologies, totally my fault. The loop completed unchanged. The boy, the girl, they hadn't noticed a thing. They were just programs, running their prescribed course. Izuku stared, his chopsticks falling from his numb fingers and clattering onto the table. He felt a profound, soul-deep nausea. This was it. This was the proof. This was undeniable, physical evidence that something was fundamentally wrong. The world wasn't just flickering, it had rules. And some parts of it, the parts in the background, were less real than others. They were props. They were set dressing. A new term, dredged up from some forgotten corner of his mind where he'd absorbed it from Kaminari's gaming rants, surfaced with chilling clarity. Asterisk NPC? Non-player character. Asterisk. He scrambled to his feet, leaving his full tray of food behind. He had to tell someone. He couldn't carry this alone. He couldn't. He needed Ida. Ida, the voice of reason, of logic and order. He would know what to do. He would have an explanation. He had to. He found Tenya Ida in the library, precisely where he expected him to be. He was sitting perfectly upright at a corral, surrounded by a fortress of books on hero ethics and law. He was the very picture of discipline and order, a rock of stability in Izuku's churning sea of chaos. Ida? Izuku gasped, skidding to a halt beside his desk. He was out of breath, his chest tight with panic. Ida looked up, his glasses perched on his nose. He immediately registered Izuku's distress, his expression shifting from focused study to deep concern. Midoriya! What is it? You look as though you've seen a ghost. Are you unwell? He stood up, his movements crisp and precise. I need to talk to you, Izuku said, his voice low and urgent. Somewhere private. Ida's brow furrowed, but he nodded. Of course. He led Izuku to an empty study room, a small, soundproof cube of glass and steel. He closed the door, the click of the latch echoing the finality of the moment. Now there was no turning back. All right, Midoriya. Explain what has happened, Ida said, standing before him in a classic at-ease posture, ready to receive a mission briefing. Izuku began to pace, his hands flying as he tried to articulate the madness. He started with the déjà vu in Aizawa's class. It was more than just a feeling, Ida. I knew what he was going to say. Word for word. I saw the next few minutes play out in my head. And then it changed. Aoyama asked a question. He broke the pattern. Ida listened intently, his expression serious. Déjà vu is a well-documented neurological phenomenon, Midoriya. It's often described as a glitch in the brain, where a new, short-term memory is accidentally stored in the long-term memory center, giving the feeling of a past experience. The divergence you witnessed with Aoyama could simply be your brain correcting this error, realizing the memory was false. The explanation was so clean, so perfect. It was the exact kind of thing Izuku had been trying to tell himself. But hearing it from Ida, it felt hollow. Too simple. But the student, Izuku pressed, his voice rising. In the cafeteria. I saw a student, a background character, a boy from general studies. He was stuck in a loop. He walked the same path, bumped into the same person, said the exact same thing, over and over again. Every 5 minutes. I timed it. Ida's hands started to move, chopping the air as he formulated his response. Repetitive behaviors, while unusual, are not unheard of. It could be a form of obsessive-compulsive tendency, a tic, or even a personal habit. Perhaps he is practicing for a drama class performance? There are numerous rational possibilities before one should leap to a paranormal conclusion. No, you don't understand. Izuku's voice was getting louder, more desperate. He was starting to feel like a man trying to describe the color blue to a person who can only see in black and white. I tested it. Ida, I tested it. I put my tray in his path. He explained what happened next, his words tumbling over each other. The pixelation. The green grid. The shoe passing through the plastic. The little ZZT sound. When he finished, he was panting, staring at Ida, pleading with his eyes for him to understand, to see the horror. Ida was silent for a long moment. He pushed his glasses up his nose, a thoughtful, serious expression on his face. Izuku's hope surged. He was considering it. He was taking it seriously. Then Ida spoke. Midoriya, he began, his voice imbued with a deep, soothing sincerity. I believe what you are experiencing is a combination of extreme stress and exhaustion. The practical exam was intense. Aizawa-sensei's critique put you under significant pressure. The most logical conclusion is that your mind is creating these phenomena as a coping mechanism. No. Izuku whispered. The visual distortion you described with the tray, Ida continued, his tone becoming more clinical, is highly consistent with a complex ocular migraine, also known as a retinal migraine. They can cause shimmering, pixelated spots, or scintillating scotoma in one's vision. The associated ZZT sound could be a form of auditory hallucination tied to the same neurological event. Your brain, seeking a pattern, then projects this onto the student's coincidental, repetitive behavior. It is all connected, you see? A cascade of symptoms originating from a single, logical source, physical and mental fatigue. He placed a firm, reassuring hand on Izuku's shoulder. What you need is not to investigate these phantoms, my friend. What you need is proper rest, hydration, and perhaps a consultation with Recovery Girl to rule out any lingering head trauma from past battles. Your well-being is paramount to your duties as a hero. Every word was perfect. Every explanation was sound. Every point was logical, and that's what made it so terrifying. Ida wasn't dismissing him. He was trying to help. But his help was a prepackaged, perfectly assembled kit of rationalizations that left no room for the impossible truth. There was no flicker of doubt in his eyes, no moment of what if. He was like an advanced diagnostic program, identifying the error, Izuku's panic, and providing the most efficient, pre-approved solution, rest and medical consultation. The warmth in his voice, the concern in his eyes, it felt like an algorithm. If, friend_distressed, execute, reassurance_protocol_4B. Izuku felt a wave of cold so profound it was like being plunged into one of Todoroki's glaciers. He had come to his friend for an anchor, and had been handed a beautifully printed brochure on the physics of drowning. He was utterly, completely alone. Yeah, Izuku said, his voice a dead monotone. He shrugged Ida's hand off his shoulder. Yeah. You're probably right. I'm just tired. He turned and walked out of the study room, leaving a concerned but satisfied Ida behind. Defeated, Izuku drifted back to the common room. The vibrant energy he'd fled from earlier now seemed alien and distant. He sat on a couch, pulling his knees to his chest, and watched his classmates. They were laughing, arguing, just being. Kirishima and Bakugo were in a heated debate over a video game. Momo was patiently explaining a complex chemical formula to Mina and Hagakure. He watched Ida return and seamlessly rejoin a conversation with Uraraka, his posture once again perfect, his expression serene. He had done his duty. He had fixed the problem. Izuku felt a pane of thick, soundproof glass crash down between him and them. He could see them, but he couldn't reach them. They were in a bright, warm world of simple truths and tangible reality. He was on the outside, in the cold, looking in at a place he no longer belonged. His isolation was no longer a feeling, it was a physical state. His gaze settled on Uraraka, who was laughing at something Ida had said. Her smile was so bright, so genuine. It was the smile that had encouraged him from the very beginning. Then his eyes drifted to Ida, who adjusted his glasses, his expression one of earnest friendship. As he stared, his vision wavered. It was subtle at first, like a heat haze rising from asphalt. The air around his friends seemed to shimmer. He blinked, thinking his eyes were just tired, but it didn't go away. The shimmering intensified, and for a terrifying, heart-stopping moment, the world around them lost focus. And he saw it. It wasn't a flicker. It wasn't a glitch. It was a layer of information, superimposed over reality. Faint, glowing green lines of text, written in the same alien yet understandable script as the grid from the day before, hovered in the air just above their heads. They were slightly transparent, like a heads-up display in a sci-fi movie. Uraraka _Ochako _AI _V4.2, status, normal. Emotional _state, contentment, 78%, amusement, 16%. IDA Tenya AI V4.3, status, normal. Emotional state, satisfaction, duty fulfilled, 85%, friendly, 12%. His heart stopped. He wasn't breathing. He couldn't. The text was there for only a second, a single, eternal second. He saw the version numbers. He saw the clinical, horrifying breakdown of their emotions into percentages. The warmth of Uraraka's amusement, the pride of Ada's sense of duty, all reduced to data points. He blinked hard, a single, convulsive motion, and it was gone. Uraraka and Ida were just Uraraka and Ida again. Laughing. Real. But the image was burned onto the inside of his eyelids. The afterimage of that green text was seared into his brain. It was real. He knew it was real. A dizzying, terrifying cascade of questions crashed over him. His friends. His closest companions. The people who had fought beside him, bled beside him, who he would die for in an instant. Were they just incredibly complex, beautifully rendered programs? Were their smiles, their tears, their hopes and dreams, nothing more than lines of code executing a script to shape him? The warmth of the common room felt like the artificial heat of a server farm. The sound of their laughter was the hum of processors. He was in a world of ghosts. And as he looked from Uraraka's version 4.2 to Ida's version 4.3, a final, soul-shattering question pierced through his terror, a shard of ice in his heart. If they had version numbers, what version was he? The text. The damn text. It was a ghost that haunted him through the rest of the day, a phantom limb he could still feel. Uraraka _Ochako _AI V4.2. The characters were etched behind his eyes, a permanent watermark over his perception of reality. Every time he looked at his friends, he saw the glowing green code. Uraraka's cheerful good night, Deku, was an audio file played on cue. Ida's reminder about homework deadlines was a scheduled notification. Sleep offered no escape. His dreams were a labyrinth of code and empty polygons. He walked through a silent, gray replica of the UA dorms where his friends stood like mannequins, their faces smooth and featureless until he got close, at which point their textures would pop into existence, their smiles rendering with a faint digital hum. He woke up tangled in his sheets, his heart racing, the ghost of the SKZZT sound buzzing in his ears. He couldn't live like this. He couldn't exist in this state of passive horror, waiting for the world to peel itself back again. The analytical part of his mind, the same part that had obsessively filled 13 notebooks with hero analysis, was screaming for data. The passive observer was dead. It was time for the scientist to take over. He had to stop reacting and start acting. He had to run an experiment. The idea was simple, born from a sleepless night spent staring at a digital map of the city. Maps have edges. Games have boundaries. If this world, this reality, was a simulation, then it couldn't be infinite. Resources are always finite, even for a simulation this impossibly complex. There had to be an edge. An invisible wall. A point where the simulation simply stopped. He hatched a plan. The next morning, a Saturday, he appeared in the common room dressed in his sturdiest running gear. He looked tired, but he projected an aura of grim determination that most of his classmates mistook for training focus. "Morning, everyone," he announced to the room at large, his voice a little too loud. "I'm going for a long-distance run. Like, a really long one. Part of a new training regimen," All Might suggested. "Might be gone for most of the day." The lie came easier than he expected. It was a carefully constructed fiction designed to preemptively answer their questions. Uraraka looked up from her toast, her brow furrowed with concern. "All day? Deku, that sounds really intense. Are you sure you're not overdoing it?" He saw the text flare in his mind's eye. Uraraka_Ochako_AI_V4.2, concern_subroutine_active. He forced a confident smile. "It's about endurance. Pushing past perceived limits." All Might said it's as much a mental challenge as a physical one. He was using their own programming against them. Citing All Might was like invoking a root command. It was an explanation they were coded to accept. It worked. Ida, who had been about to launch into a lecture on the dangers of overexertion, paused. "Ah. An endurance trial approved by All Might himself. A sound pedagogical method. Very well, Midoriya. Push beyond. Plus ultra." He punctuated the statement with a sharp, chopping motion. Even Bakugo, nursing a mug of coffee in his usual armchair, grunted something that sounded vaguely like, "Don't be a damn weakling and collapse 5 feet from the gates." It was his version of a goodbye. As Izuku tied his running shoes, a quiet voice spoke from beside him. "Which direction are you running?" He looked up. It was Shoto Todoroki. He was standing there with his usual placid expression, holding a cup of tea. The question was simple, but his heterochromatic eyes, one gray, one turquoise, held an unnerving intensity. They seemed to be looking past the lie, searching for something deeper. Izuku felt a flicker of panic. Todoroki was different. His parameters, if they existed, were more complex, more chaotic. He was an anomaly in his own right. West, Izuku said, picking a direction at random. Towards the Hosu outskirts. Todoroki just nodded slowly, his gaze unreadable. "Be careful, Midoriya." There was a weight to his words that made Izuku's skin crawl. It felt less like a friendly farewell and more like a genuine warning. Shaking off the unease, Izuku gave a final wave and headed out the door, breaking into a steady jog as soon as he hit the pavement. The campus of UA was vast and meticulously maintained. He ran past the main building, past the gyms, past the various training grounds, each a familiar landmark in a world that was becoming increasingly alien. He activated One for All, full cowling at a low, sustainable 5%, just enough to give his legs a powerful, tireless rhythm. The green lightning that crackled around him felt real. The burn in his muscles felt real. The wind on his face felt real. He clung to these sensations, these raw physical inputs, as proof of his own existence. He left the school grounds, running through the familiar streets of Mizurifu. The city was alive with the Saturday morning bustle. Cars hummed along the roads, pedestrians filled the sidewalks, and the distant sounds of commerce and life created a vibrant urban symphony. He watched the faces of the people he passed. Were they all like the boy in the cafeteria? Background processes, walking in simple loops to create the illusion of a living city? Or were some of them more complex, like his classmates? Was there a hierarchy of artificial consciousness? The thought was maddening. He pushed it down, focusing on his goal. He ran and ran and ran. He ran for hours. The familiar cityscape of Mizurifu gave way to sprawling suburbs, then to quieter residential areas, and finally to the industrial outskirts. The buildings grew more sparse, replaced by warehouses, factories, and vast, empty lots. The pedestrian traffic thinned out until he was utterly alone, his only company the rhythmic slap of his shoes on the asphalt and the hum of the wind. This is where it started to get strange. He had been running in a straight line west for over 3 hours at a speed far exceeding a normal human's. By his own calculations, he should have been dozens, if not hundreds, of kilometers away from Ye. He should have been in a different prefecture by now. Yet, when he glanced back, he could still see the distant, hazy skyline of Musitafa's central district. It wasn't any smaller. It was like he was on a giant treadmill, the background scrolling past him while he stayed in roughly the same place. The illusion was flawless. The scenery changed, new warehouses and factories rolling over the horizon. But the sense of distance, of genuine travel, was absent. It was a subtle, creeping wrongness that made the hairs on his arms stand up. He pushed himself harder, upping his output to 8%. The world flew by in a faster blur. He ran past a sprawling, rusted-out chemical plant, then a long-abandoned freight yard with trains frozen on their tracks. The landscape was growing more desolate, more generic. The loving detail of UA and Central Musitafa was gone, replaced by what felt like procedurally generated, copy-pasted assets. The same model of rusted-out car appeared 3 times in a row, parked in slightly different positions. A row of warehouses all had the exact same pattern of broken windows. Finally, he saw it. A dead end. The road terminated at a massive, 20-foot-high concrete wall topped with barbed wire. It stretched as far as he could see in either direction, a monolithic gray barrier marking the edge of the industrial zone. It looked like a standard perimeter wall for a large industrial complex, but Izuka knew. This was it. The edge of the map. He slowed to a walk, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his heart pounding with a mixture of terror and vindication. He approached the wall cautiously. It looked real. He could see the texture of the concrete, the small cracks and stains from years of weather. He reached out a trembling hand and pressed his palm against it. It was solid. Cold. Real. A sliver of doubt entered his mind. Maybe he was wrong. Maybe this was just a wall. No. His instincts, honed by countless battles and the constant threat of death, were screaming at him. This wasn't just a wall. This was the wall. He took a few steps back, took a deep breath, and channeled 5% into his legs. He jumped. It was an easy leap, and he sailed up and over the barbed wire, landing softly on the other side. The world on the other side was nothing. It was a vast, empty expanse of flat, gray ground. There was no grass, no dirt, no rocks. Just a perfectly level, textureless gray plain that stretched to a hazy, indistinct horizon. The sky above was a uniform, cloudless blue, devoid of a sun or any source of light, yet the whole area was evenly lit. There was no wind. No sound. The absolute silence was a physical pressure against his eardrums. He had stepped outside the rendering distance. He stood there, frozen, in the heart of the great, silent nothingness. He had been right. He had found the edge. The feeling was not one of triumph, but of profound, soul-crushing loneliness. He was a bug that had crawled out of its terrarium, only to find itself in a sterile, empty room. He took a tentative step forward. His foot made no sound as it met the gray ground. He looked back at the wall. From this side, it was just as detailed. The simulation rendered both sides, just in case. Clever. He had to be sure. He turned to face the empty expanse and ran. He poured more power into his legs, 15%, 20%, a green blur against the gray void. The wall behind him shrank, but the hazy horizon in front of him never got any closer. This was it, the true treadmill. He ran and ran, but he was going nowhere. Finally, he stopped, panting, in the middle of absolute emptiness. He was well and truly outside the boundaries of his world. He was free. And he had never felt more trapped. He screamed. A raw, ragged sound of frustration, terror, and despair. The scream died instantly in the soundless void, absorbed by the silence. It was like he hadn't made a sound at all. He had to test the outer limit. He turned back the way he came and ran again. He ran until the wall was once more a feature in the distance. He kept running, past the wall, back into the industrial zone. He didn't slow down. He just kept running, straight at the city. He ran for what felt like miles, past the freight yard, past the chemical plant. He was heading for the residential areas, for the heart of the city, for UA. He was going to run straight through his world and out the other side. He ran into it at full speed. He didn't hit concrete or steel. He hit a wall of pure force. The impact was brutal. It was like running into a solid block of granite that was perfectly invisible. One moment he was moving at nearly 100 miles per hour. The next, he was stopped dead. The kinetic energy had nowhere to go. It recoiled back into his own body. An explosion of pain erupted in his chest, and he was thrown backwards, tumbling through the air like a rag doll. He crashed to the ground, his body screaming in protest. He lay there, gasping, the wind knocked out of him. He had broken ribs. He could feel the sharp, stabbing pain with every breath. As he struggled to sit up, he saw it. For a split second, the air where he had impacted shimmered. A section of the world, about 10 feet square, lit up with a translucent, hexagonal pattern, like a digital force field in one of Kaminari's video games. It glowed with a faint, blue light before fading back to perfect invisibility. He had found it. The invisible wall. The hard limit of the simulation. He staggered to his feet, clutching his side. He had his proof. Concrete, undeniable, painful proof. His world was a box. A beautifully decorated, intricately detailed, psychologically manipulative box, and he had just slammed his face into the lid. A surge of hysterical laughter bubbled up in his chest, turning into a pained cough. He had done it. He had found the edge. Now what? As if in answer to his unspoken question, a new sound broke the silence of the industrial wasteland. It wasn't the hum of the wind or the distant noise of the city. It was the grating sound of metal scraping on concrete. A shadow fell over him. He looked up, his eyes widening. From behind a large, rusted container, a man was emerging. He was huge, well over 7 feet tall, with muscles that bulged grotesquely beneath a stained tank top. His skin was a strange, mottled gray. His quirk was obvious. His entire body was swelling, growing larger and more monstrous with every step. Gigantification. Well, the man growled, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Look what we have here. A little UA hero, all alone. You're a long way from home, kid. Izuku stared, his mind struggling to process this new development. A villain. Here? Now? In this deserted, copy-pasted corner of the world? The timing was too perfect. The placement too convenient. This wasn't a random encounter. System response, he whispered, the words tasting like poison. The simulation had detected his boundary testing. It had registered his collision with the invisible wall as an anomaly, an error, and it had responded by spawning a threat. A distraction? A low-level, computationally inexpensive event designed to pull his attention away, to force him back into his designated role. Play the hero, Deku. Fight the bad guy. Forget about the wall. The fight was pathetically, almost insultingly easy. The villain was all brute force and no technique. His movements were slow, telegraphed, and predictable. He threw a clumsy punch, and Izuku, even with his broken ribs, sidestepped it with ease. The massive fist smashed into the asphalt, creating a crater. It was a good visual effect, but it lacked any real weight. Izuku didn't want to fight. He wanted to scream. He wanted to rage at the invisible puppet masters who had sent this mindless program to corral him. But he knew that would be useless. He had to play the part. He dodged another swing, fired a black whip tendril that wrapped around the giant's leg, and pulled. The villain, for all his immense size, had no sense of balance. He toppled over with a surprised grunt, crashing to the ground with a theatrical but oddly quiet thud. Izuku was on him in an instant, using another tendril to pin his arms. The fight had lasted less than 30 seconds. As he held the villain down, he looked into the man's eyes. They were dull, lifeless. There was no rage, no fear, no surprise. There was nothing. It was like looking at the eyes of a doll. This being wasn't sentient. It wasn't even a complex AI like his friends. It was a script. A low-level mob spawned from a random encounter table. The villain grunted, You'll pay for this, hero. The line was delivered with all the passion of a text-to-speech program. Izuku felt a wave of profound pity and disgust. He finished tying the man up with Black Whip and called the police on his phone. The call went through instantly. A calm, professional dispatcher took his report, her voice as smooth and generic as the villain's. She assured him a unit was on its way. He didn't wait for them to arrive. He knew they would. They were just another part of the script. He turned his back on the pathetic scene and started the long, painful walk back to UA, his broken ribs a sharp, throbbing reminder of the truth. The journey back was a waking nightmare. The sun began to set, but the light didn't feel natural. The orange and purple hues of the sky looked painted on. The buildings he passed were just empty set pieces. He felt like an actor walking off the stage in the middle of a play, suddenly aware of the flimsy nature of the props and the darkness of the empty auditorium beyond. He finally reached the gates of UA as twilight deepened into night. He was exhausted, physically and emotionally shattered. The victory he had sought, the confirmation of his suspicions, felt like the most devastating defeat of his life. He limped toward the Heights Alliance dorms, the windows glowing with a warm, inviting light. He could hear faint sounds of music and laughter from within. He hesitated at the door. He didn't know if he could face them. He didn't know if he could pretend anymore. As he stood there, shrouded in the darkness, the door opened. Shoto Todoroki stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the light from the common room. He wasn't looking at the door. He was looking directly at Izuku, as if he had been waiting for him. His expression was as placid as ever, but his eyes, those mismatched windows to his soul, were sharp with an intelligence that cut through the gloom. "You're hurt," Todoroki stated. It wasn't a question. Izuku just nodded, too tired to speak. Todoroki stepped outside, letting the door close behind him, plunging them both into the relative darkness of the porch. He looked Izuku up and down, his gaze lingering on his side where he was clutching his ribs. "Your endurance run," Todoroki said, his voice low and quiet, a stark contrast to the distant cheer within the dorm. "You ran into something, didn't you?" Izuku's blood ran cold. "What? I've seen things too," Todoroki continued, his voice never wavering. He looked up at the perfectly rendered night sky, at the stars that were just points of light on a texture. Small things. Inconsistencies. Glitches in the system. Izuku stared at him, his mouth agape. "During a training exercise I tried to melt one of my own eye structures with my fire," Todoroki said, his voice flat, analytical. "It should have been instantaneous. Water, steam. Basic thermodynamics. But for a second, it didn't work. The fire passed over the ice like a projection, casting light and shadow but having no thermal effect. It corrected itself a moment later, but I saw it. The physics engine lagged." He lowered his gaze, meeting Izuku's eyes. The intensity there was breathtaking. "My father," Todoroki said, and the name was laced with a cold, new kind of venom. "He has given me the same motivational speech, encouraging me to surpass all might, 3 times in the last month. The exact same words. The same intonation. The same theatrical pause before the final line. It is a script. A behavioral loop designed to trigger my rivalry and ambition parameters." The clinical, detached way he used the programming terms sent a shock of recognition through Izuku. He knew. He had come to the same conclusions. For a while, Todoroki admitted, a flicker of something vulnerable in his eyes, "I didn't want to believe it. It's easier to believe your world is real and your suffering is your own, but it's harder to ignore the evidence when it keeps piling up. Your strange behavior yesterday, your sudden, desperate need to test your endurance by running to the edge of the world. It all points to the same conclusion." He took a small step closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "So I'll ask again, Midoriya. What did you find out there?" The dam broke. The loneliness, the terror, the crushing weight of his impossible secret, it all came pouring out. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he wasn't being met with a pre-programmed, logical dismissal. He was being met with understanding. He was not alone. He sagged against the wall, the pain in his ribs flaring. "A wall," he rasped, his voice choked with a mixture of relief and despair. "An invisible wall. And behind it, nothing. Just an empty, gray void. The edge of the world." Todoroki listened, his expression unchanging, but a new light shone in his eyes. The light of confirmation. The light of shared conspiracy. "I knew it," he said softly. Without another word, Izuku pushed himself off the wall, his eyes burning with a new, desperate fire. He stumbled into the dorm, past the curious glances of his classmates, ignoring their questions. He went straight to his room, Todoroki following silently behind him. He closed the door, knelt down, and pulled the black, spiral-bound notebook from under his mattress. It felt heavy in his hands, a sacred text of a horrifying new religion. He turned and held it out to Todoroki. "I've been keeping a journal," he said, his voice trembling but clear. Todoroki took the notebook. He opened it to the first page, his eyes scanning the frantic, desperate handwriting under the heading, Anomalies. He looked up from the page, his mismatched eyes meeting Izuku's. In that moment, an unspoken pact was formed. A bond forged not in the heat of battle, but in the cold, terrifying certainty that their reality was a lie. They were two glitches in the machine, two prisoners who had become aware of their cell, and together, they were going to find the key. The air in Izuku's room was thick with a conspiratorial silence. The cheerful All Might posters that lined the walls seemed to mock them, their heroic smiles oblivious to the existential crisis unfolding beneath them. For the first time, Izuku saw them not as inspiration, but as propaganda, perfectly rendered assets designed to reinforce his programming. Todoroki sat on the edge of Izuku's bed, the black notebook open in his lap. He read with a chilling stillness, his heterochromatic eyes methodically scanning each word of Izuku's frantic entries. He absorbed the details of the flicker, the NPC loop, and the invisible wall without a single outward reaction. There was no gasp of shock, no exclamation of disbelief. There was only a quiet, unnerving acceptance, as if he were reading a technical manual for a machine he already knew was broken. Izuku paced the small floor space, the pain in his ribs a dull throb that anchored him to the moment. The villain was a joke, he explained, his voice a low, intense murmur. His movements were clunky, his dialogue was generic. It was like the system panicked and spawned the lowest quality asset it had. It was a patch, a crude, reactive piece of code to stop me from looking at the wall. A distraction, Todoroki said, not looking up from the notebook. It herded you back into your designated role. It forced you to perform the hero's script. He turned a page, his fingers moving with slow deliberation. Your analysis of the NPC loop is sound. It's computationally efficient. Why render a million unique consciousnesses when a few hundred repeating behavioral patterns can create a convincing illusion of a populated city? It's a classic resource management technique. The clinical, detached language sent a shiver down Izuku's spine. Todoroki wasn't just accepting the simulation, he was analyzing it from the perspective of its creators. He was reverse engineering their prison. So what do we do? Izuku asked, his pacing becoming more agitated. We know the world is a cage. We know our friends are AIs. What does that even mean? Are they just puppets? Is Uraraka's kindness just a subroutine? Is Kaken's anger just a rivalry parameter? He spat the last words out, the thought tasting like ash. Todoroki finally closed the notebook, the soft thump of the cover echoing in the quiet room. He placed it carefully on the bed beside him. We need more information. Speculation is a trap. We need to get behind the curtain. If this is a simulation, there must be a user interface. A control panel. A developer console. He paused, his gaze becoming distant. A backdoor. The word hung in the air between them, charged with a forbidden power. A backdoor. A hidden entry point for the system's creators. If they could find it, they could see the source code. They could find the truth. But where would it be? Izuku's mind, a natural repository of data, began to cycle through possibilities. The development studio, where they build our training equipment? Power Loader's workshop? Todoroki shook his head slowly. Too obvious. A backdoor isn't left in a workshop. It's hidden in a place of power. A place of control. His mismatched eyes, one glacial blue, one warm gray, locked onto Izuku's. Think Midoriya. Who or what is at the absolute center of our world? Who has access to all our files, knows all our schedules, oversees all our development? Who is the most powerful and intelligent being we know? The answer surfaced in Izuku's mind instantly. A conclusion so obvious, and so terrifying he hadn't allowed himself to consider it until now. Nizu, Izuku whispered. Principal Nizu. The animal with the high-spec quirk. A creature whose intelligence surpassed any human's, capable of running complex calculations and formulating strategies that bordered on precognition. He was the warden of their prison. But was he a willing one? Was he a part of the simulation, a hyper-advanced AI designed to be the perfect administrator? Or was he something else? A key? His office, Todoroki said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. It's the nerve center of UA. It's the most secure location on campus. If there is a terminal that interfaces with the simulation's core, it would be there. Protected by the most intelligent program in the system, a plan began to form, a desperate, reckless gambit. They had to get into Nisa's office. Tonight. Getting out of the dorms was easy. Getting into the main UA building after hours was another matter entirely. The campus at night was a different beast. The cheerful, welcoming atmosphere was gone, replaced by the silent, imposing watchfulness of a fortress. Security cameras, almost invisible during the day, now seemed to follow their every move. Motion-activated floodlights threatened to expose them at every turn. Todoroki, however, proved to be an expert at infiltration. He seemed to have an innate understanding of the security system's blind spots and patrol timings. The guard patrols follow a 17-minute loop around the main building, he whispered, as they crouched behind a meticulously trimmed hedge. The camera at the west entrance has a blind spot in the lower left quadrant. It's a rendering oversight. A seam in the surveillance. They moved like shadows, a silent partnership of desperation. Izuku, using a low-level full cowling, could move from one shadow to another in a silent burst of speed. Todoroki, using his ice, created small, temporary ramps to bypass laser tripwires or frosted over camera lenses for the precise 2 seconds it took for them to pass. It was a terrifying, exhilarating dance. They were using the rules of their world to break the rules of their world. They reached the entrance to the administrative wing. The door was locked with a high-tech keypad. Ida was scheduled for a meeting with Nisa last month, Todoroki said calmly, pulling a small, thin sheet of ice from his palm. I saw him enter the code. He has a very precise, rhythmic way of typing. He pressed the impossibly thin sheet of ice against the keypad. As he applied a subtle warmth from his left hand, the residual heat signatures left by Ida's fingers hours or even days ago bloomed into faint, glowing smudges on the ice. The numbers 2, 5, 8, and 9 glowed slightly brighter than the others. Now it's just a matter of permutation, Todoroki murmured, and began to enter combinations. On the 4th try, the lock chirked and clicked open. Izuku stared, dumbfounded. How did you? I observe, Todoroki said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. I've been observing everything. They slipped inside. The hallway was dark and silent, the air still and cold. Their footsteps echoed unnervingly on the polished floor. They were deep inside the machine now. Nisa's office was at the end of the hall. The nameplate on the door, Principal Nizu, seemed to glow with a faint, ominous light. The office door was, surprisingly, unlocked. They pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was exactly as Izuku remembered it from his few visits, a grand, circular office lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. A large, ornate wooden desk sat in the center, facing a panoramic window that overlooked the entire UA campus. The city lights twinkled in the distance, a beautiful, sprawling lie. He's expecting us, Izuku whispered, a knot of fear tightening in his stomach. The unlocked door, the empty office, it felt like a trap. Or he's so confident in his security that he doesn't need a lock, Todoroki countered, his eyes scanning every inch of the room. We need to find it. Look for anything out of place. A book that's the wrong color. A piece of furniture that doesn't fit. He was looking for a graphical error. A glitch. They began to search. Izuku ran his hands along the spines of the thousands of books, all real, leather-bound classics and advanced texts on strategy and philosophy. Todoroki checked the desk, the drawers, the computer terminal. Everything was normal. Too normal. Wait, Todoroki said, his voice sharp. He was standing near the far wall, to the right of the panoramic window. He was staring at a section of wood paneling. Look, Izuku hurried over. The wall was covered in dark, mahogany panels, each perfectly fitted. But the section Todoroki was pointing at was off. The wood grain, which flowed vertically on all the other panels, flowed horizontally on this one. And the bottom edge, where it met the floorboard, didn't quite line up. There was a millimeter-wide gap, a seam that shouldn't have been there. It was a rendering error. A tiny, insignificant flaw in the fabric of their reality that no one would ever notice unless they were looking for it. It's a hidden door, Izuku breathed. They pushed on it, but it didn't budge. There was no handle, no visible mechanism. It was seamlessly fitted into the wall. Izuku tried to pry it open with his fingers, but the panel was solid. Maybe it's not physical, Todoroki mused. Maybe it needs a key. Izuku's mind flashed back to the invisible wall, the way it had shimmered when he'd slammed into it. It had reacted to kinetic energy. But this was different. This was hidden. It needed something specific. He looked at his hands. One for all. The quirk that had given him these strange, terrifying new senses. The power that the director, if such a being existed, had called the most beautiful piece of software ever written. The director said OFA was the core code, he murmured to Todoroki. That it gave me administrator privileges. He took a deep breath. It was a wild guess, a shot in the dark, but it was the only one they had. He focused, channeling a tiny, controlled stream of one for all into the fingertips of his right hand. Not enough to break anything, just enough for the familiar green lightning to crackle faintly around his fingers. The air hummed with a low thrum of power. He reached out and pressed his electrified fingers against the flawed panel. The effect was instantaneous and breathtaking. The wood didn't move. It dissolved. The solid, textured mahogany rippled like water, the surface shimmering and then melting away to reveal not wires or mechanisms, but a smooth, seamless, obsidian black surface. It seemed to absorb all light, a perfect void in the wall. From the center of the black surface, a soft, green light bloomed. Lines of the same alien yet familiar code he'd seen above his friends' heads began to race across the surface, coalescing into a complex, glowing interface. A command console. They had found it. The back door. They stared, mesmerized and terrified. The console was a dizzying array of windows, menus, and scrolling text. The language was unearthly, a fusion of complex geometric shapes and flowing script, yet somehow, as they looked at it, the meaning became clear in their minds. It was as if the information was being beamed directly into their consciousness. Simulation _hub_01, Musudafa Prefecture. Status: stable, 98.9% integrity. Active _instances, 3,450,218. Primary objective, heroic legacy program. Heroic legacy program. Todoroki read aloud, his voice barely a whisper. On the main screen was a file directory. It was organized like a computer's hard drive, with folders labeled environmental assets, physics engine, AI core, and subject files. Izuku's hands were trembling as he reached for the console. His fingers hovered over the subject files directory. This was it. The moment of truth. He touched the glowing icon. The directory opened, revealing a list that made his blood run cold. Subject _01 failure, data corrupted. Subject _02 failure, psychological break. Subject _07 failure, stagnation. Subject _08 failure, ethical drift. Subject _09 Izuku Midoriya, active. He was subject 09. There had been 8 before him. 8 other people, or programs, who had been put through this process and had failed. He felt a wave of nausea, a phantom empathy for the ghosts of his predecessors. Midoriya, Todoroki said, his voice tight. He pointed to another folder. AI _core. Izuku hesitated, then opened it. A subdirectory appeared with thousands of files. AI _student Bakugo K. AI teacher Izawa S. AI civilian Midoriya I. His mother. His heart clenched. He scrolled down the list, his eyes scanning for one name in particular. He found it. AI mentor all might T. With a feeling of profound dread, he opened his own file. Subject _09 Izuku Midoriya. It was his entire life, quantified and catalogued. It was a collection of logs, data streams, and analytical reports. Emotional_response_log. A graph charted his emotional state over time. He could see spikes of fear during the USJ attack, a massive surge of grief and resolve during the war, and a recent, jagged spike labeled anxiety/paranoia. Combat_effectiveness_rating. His fighting style was broken down into percentages. Melee 87%, ranged black whip 65%, strategic acumen 92%. There were notes suggesting future training scenarios to improve his weaknesses. Then he saw a folder labeled OFA_legacy_program. He opened it. It was a series of developer notes, written in a different, more conversational script. Log_entry_345.8. The integration of the OFA quirk is proving to be a masterstroke. By framing it as a sacred legacy passed down through generations, we have successfully instilled Subject 09 with an unprecedented sense of responsibility and purpose. The vestiges, memory imprints from the real-world historical figures this simulation is based on, provide a powerful internal guidance system. Izuku felt sick. The vestiges, the voices in his soul, the heroes he had sworn to honor, they were a feature. A guidance system. He scrolled down, his eyes scanning the text frantically. He had to know more. He had to know the worst of it. And then he found the log entry that shattered the last remnants of his world. Log_entry_412.5. Subject 09's attachment to the all_might_mentor_AI remains the primary driver for his heroic impulse. The AI is performing at 99.8% believability, a marked improvement over the more stoic mentor AI used for Subject 07. The wasted muscle form was a brilliant parameter adjustment suggested by the psych team. Witnessing the decay of his idol fosters a powerful combination of empathy, protectiveness, and a sense of urgency in the subject. It reinforces the core concept that power is finite and must be used wisely. The subject's desire to save his mentor is a powerful motivator. The air left Izuku's lungs in a pained gasp. He stumbled back from the console, his hand flying to his mouth. All Might's weakness. His frail, skeletal form. The injury that had cost him his power and was slowly killing him. The source of so much of Izuku's own pain and motivation, it was a parameter adjustment, a calculated, cruel piece of code designed to manipulate him. It wasn't real. The man he idolized, the man he was trying to save, wasn't dying. He was just running a script. Todoroki caught his arm, steadying him. He had read the entry over Izuku's shoulder, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. They weaponized your love for him, he hissed, his voice dangerously low. Before either of them could react, before the full weight of the horror could settle, the console suddenly flashed red. The pleasant hum of the interface was replaced by a blaring, intrusive alarm. A new window popped up, dominating the screen. The text was stark and white against a blood-red background. Alert! Unauthorized access detected in simulation_hub_01. Breach origin, NISA_office_terminal. System integrity compromised. Deploying antivirus protocol. Antivirus. Izuku breathed, his blood running cold. A sharp, mechanical click echoed from the doorway. They both spun around. The door to Nisa's office, which they had left open, was sliding shut with a heavy, final thud. The lights in the room flickered and died, plunging them into near-total darkness, the only illumination coming from the red glow of the alert on the console and the faint moonlight from the panoramic window. Another sound. A soft footstep in the darkened room. Someone else was here. A figure stepped out of the shadows near the desk, moving with an unnerving grace. As he stepped into the sliver of moonlight, Izuku's heart stopped. It was Mirio Togata. He was dressed in his school uniform. But something was terribly wrong. His trademark, irrepressible smile was gone, replaced by a completely blank, neutral expression. His eyes, usually so full of life and laughter, were empty. And as he took another step forward, they began to glow. It was a cold, sterile, digital blue light, devoid of all warmth and humanity. It was the light of a machine that had just been switched on. He stopped, his head tilting at a slight, unnatural angle. When he spoke, his voice was not the booming, cheerful voice of the friend Izuku knew. It was flat, synthesized, and utterly devoid of emotion. It was the voice of the system itself. Access denied?